So this is basically the start to our genetics for the last couple of weeks. And so a big part of genetics is not only understanding molecular biology, which we already talked about, and this is the central dogma whereby we know how transcription takes your genetic code and creates mRNA, the messenger for it, and then translation takes that messenger RNA and through the use of ribosomes, tRNA, and all the machinery we've talked about helps make the correct sequence of the protein. And hopefully you also understand how if you have mutations in the genome, then that's going to lead to potentially an incorrect sequence of the protein, right? Because if the code's wrong, then reading the code is going to follow the incorrect code and make the wrong protein. And if the protein sequence is incorrect, the fold is going to be incorrect and the function is going to be incorrect. And then that also, genetics is also going to relate to understanding mitosis and meiosis. And so that's week 14. And then we'll get into kind of more of the Punnett squares and the Mendelian genetics that you're a little bit more used to in week 15. All right, so before we go on to mitosis, meiosis, we need a little bit of kind of background of chromosomes and all of that aspect. So this is what I call genetics 101 or less. So talking about chromosomes. So we already know that the genotype is an individual's genetic makeup, right? So this is the actual genes, all the chromosomes, all the DNA and so forth that makes up your genome. And then the phenotype is the physical manifestation of these genes. These are the observable characteristics, sometimes even non-observable characteristics, like for example, your blood type. No one can really observe that, but you can test it and you can know the blood type. And your blood type is based on the genome, right? So the blood type is actually a specific protein set, enzymes that allow carbohydrates on your blood to be different depending on what type of blood you have. But the type of enzymes your body makes is based on what gene alleles that you have, right? So we have the physical manifestation, right? So that's the expression of the genes. So a gene is a unit of nucleic acid that specifies an inherited trait of an organism. Then the character would be that observable feature, right? So this is a kind of a broad, like this is the type of thing that we're describing. And then the trait is the particular manifestation. So let's give an example here. Ethan's genes code for the hair color character, right? So in this case, the character is hair color. It's not saying a specific hair color, but that's kind of the particular characteristic we're talking about. And then his genes for the hair color character specify brown. So brown hair is Ethan's trait. So that's the particular manifestation of the gene, right? So the gene is there's gonna be a gene basically for every character, and then that gene is gonna determine what trait you have for that character. All right, so the gene is the sequence of nucleotides that codes for that specific trait. So remember, we have nucleotides, those are like the letters. Codons would be like the words, and then a whole gene is all those codons together. It's the entire protein that's made from that. So that gene is the sequence of nucleotides that's going to code usually a specific protein, and that protein helps at least contribute to, if not cause, the specific trait. And so we know that not everyone looks alike, so that means we have different alleles. And alleles are different versions of the gene, right? So for example, you can have alleles that help you specify brown hair. You can have alleles that specify blonde hair. You can have alleles, different alleles for different eye colors, different alleles for different blood types, all types of things like that, right? So genes are the sequence that codes the trait. Allele kind of is which allele you have determines which specific trait of that you have, right? And so we are diploid. And diploid basically means that we have two copies of every chromosome. And this is because we reproduce through sexual reproduction. And that means that we got one of our copies of each chromosome from mom and the other copy from dad, right? So if we briefly take a look at this karyotype here, there are 22 autosomes, and autosomes are just the chromosomes that are not the sex chromosomes, and then one pair of the sex chromosomes. You can be XX if you're female, or XY if you're male. And so we have 23 pairs total, which means we are 46. But we talk about 23 pairs because we are diploid. We got one chromosome 1 from mom and another chromosome 1 from dad. Same with chromosome 2. One came from mom, one came from dad, and so forth for all of these. Right? And so on that chromosome, a homologous pair, all right, important definition. A homologous pair is the same type of chromosome, right? So this would be a homologous pair for chromosome 1, a homologous pair for chromosome 2, a homologous pair for chromosome 8, and so forth. And so homologous pairs work because they're the same size, the same shape, and they have the same genes. So in other words, if this gene down here codes for a part of eye color, then the one you get from mom is going to have eye color there, and the one from dad is going to have eye color there as well. But the one from mom and dad may have different alleles. Mom might have given you an allele that contributes to blue eyes, and dad might have given you an allele that contributes to brown eyes. Right? So both of those, since they're in the same spot on homologous chromosomes, they're both specifying the same character, right? In this case, eye color, but they might be different alleles, different versions of the gene, because hopefully mom and dad don't look exactly alike. That would be pretty weird. Right? And so when we talk about diploid, we say 2N. 2N is diploid, 1N is haploid. And this is going to be really important because all cells in your body, except for your gametes, right, except for mature sperm and egg, are going to be diploid. But sperm and egg have to undergo meiosis to make them haploid because we want to present only one copy of each chromosome to the next generation, because our kids should get one copy from you and one copy from your spouse, right? And not two copies from you and two copies from your spouse, because then they would have 4 copies of each, right? So we have 2 copies of each because one came from mom, one came from dad. But in order to make sperm or egg, we have to take those 2 copies and limit it back down to 1 for each chromosome so that our kid gets half of the genome from us. And so this allows us to kind of, again, see homologous pairs. So homologous pairs are the chromosome pairs, right? One from mom, one from dad, that code for the same characters. All right, so when we say we have 23 pairs, we have 23 homologous pairs. Chromosome 1 from mom, chromosome 1 from dad. And then chromosome 2 from mom, chromosome 2 from dad, and so forth. Right? And so there are going to be 2 alleles for every gene, because we got one from mom and one from dad. And if those 2 alleles happen to be the same, we call that homozygous. Right? Homozygous means you have the same alleles, one from mom and dad. If it's different, then it's heterozygous. Right? So this would be homozygous for the capital A allele, homozygous for the little a allele, and then heterozygous in this case. Right? So alleles are different versions, again, of that same gene. And this is based on slight differences in the genetic code. So slight differences in the genetic code will make slight differences in the protein sequence, which will make it fold and function slightly different. If it didn't function at all, then that might be a big problem. But if it was a slight missense where there's a different amino acid here, maybe here, then maybe it gives it a slightly different function. And overall, the different functions from the 2 different proteins based on different genetic sequences, different gene alleles, are going to have different functions and give us a different phenotype. Right? So that's kind of how alleles work. All right, and so when we talk about a karyotype basically is just looking at all the different chromosomes, and so looking at the pairs. So there's a homologous pair for chromosome 1, homologous pair for 2 and 3, all right? And so we can look at this for all the chromosomes. And what's abnormal about this set of chromosomes from this particular individual? Well, you can see that this particular individual actually has 3 of chromosome 21. We call this trisomy 21, which is more commonly referred to as Down syndrome. So if there's mistakes in meiosis, if there's a mistake in maybe the egg didn't only get 1 copy of chromosome 21, it's supposed to have 1 copy of chromosome 21 because then it combines with dad's sperm, and that has 1 copy of chromosome 21, and 1 plus 1 is back to 2. But if the egg had 2 copies of chromosome 21, the sperm contributes its 1, then that's going to be 3, and that can contribute to trisomy. And this can happen for any one of these chromosomes, but trisomy 21, chromosome 21 is the smallest, and it's one of the only ones that basically is not lethal to have an extra copy. It causes Down syndrome instead. All right, so we're also going to talk about cell division, mitosis, and meiosis as well. We've talked about this before. In order for division to happen, you need growth of the cell. The genome needs to be copied, and then you need to separate the chromosomes. That's where mitosis comes in. So if we're not bacteria, if we are actually a human, we need to separate, we need to make a copy of all 46 chromosomes, and then we need to send 1 copy of each of those 46 chromosomes to the 2 different cells, right? We can't have 2 daughter cells, one which has multiple copies of chromosome 4 and the other has no copies of chromosome 4, and vice versa. So we have to send 1 exact copy of the entire genome to each cell. and then that allows for cell division. Right? So when do you think cell division needs to happen? Well, it's pretty rare and it needs to be tightly regulated, and in the absence of regulation, that's what causes cancer. But normally, cell division occurs during reproduction. All right, so when an embryo is growing, you're first just a fertilized egg, and then that cell is going to divide and divide and divide, right, to grow. So growth and development and tissue repair. So we're often losing a lot of cells, not just by injury, but sometimes by injury, but also just cells that get old and the telomeres get too short, they're dying off, and so we're constantly replacing dead cells. So we need cell division when we're growing, and we need cell division to replace dead cells due to either injury or just normal aging of cells. And so that's where we're going to start on Monday, and we'll talk a little bit about the cell cycle itself. We'll talk a little bit about cancer, what goes wrong when the cell cycle controls aren't there, and then we're going to lead this into meiosis by the end of the week and genetics by the next week. All right. Hope you're having or had a wonderful Thanksgiving.